My name is Jade Oriana. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady. Not magnetic, not intimidating, not unforgettable, just steady. I work in corporate operations, one of those roles that keeps systems functioning while everyone else takes credit for vision. On the surface, I'm organized, dependable, and composed. The woman who remembers deadlines no one else logs. The woman who stays late without complaint. The woman who smiles politely when interrupted. If you ask my colleagues how they see me, they'd probably say I'm calm, supportive, low maintenance. If you ask my husband, he might say I'm independent, self-sufficient, quiet. But here's the truth. No one noticed soon enough. I realized I was more excited to stay late at work than go home. The office felt calmer than my own living room. That realization didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It came softly, gradually, in small, almost invisible moments, the kind you dismiss because nothing is technically wrong. No screaming arguments, no dramatic betrayals, no scandal you could point to and say, "There, that's the reason, that's..." Instead, it was something quieter. A slow erosion of being seen. This isn't a revenge story. No one gets destroyed. No one storms out. There are no slammed doors, no viral confrontations. This is a story about psychological reversal. It's about what happens when the person everyone underestimates stops trying to prove her worth and starts observing instead. It's about how silence can become a strategy. It's about the moment you realize you've been playing a role you never auditioned for. And what happens when you decide to stop performing? Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I went from being the dependable background character in my own life to quietly restructuring everything around me. Not through anger, not through manipulation, but through clarity. I'm telling this story because I know I'm not the only one who has felt safer in a conference room than at their own dinner table. I know I'm not the only one who has mistaken endurance for love, or usefulness for value. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have, simply because leaving would mean admitting you deserved more to my colleagues? I was the stabilizer, not the visionary, not the disruptor, not the one whose name was highlighted in leadership emails. I was the one who made sure the visionary's presentation actually worked. The one who noticed inconsistencies in financial projections before they reached the board. The one who stayed behind after meetings to clean up the details. They called me reliable. It sounds like a compliment. It often is. But reliability can quietly become invisible in meetings. I was the woman people turned to when they needed clarification, but not when they wanted recognition attached to it. My sentences were frequently repeated by someone else 5 minutes later, slightly louder, slightly reframed, and suddenly they were great points. I learned not to flinch. I would nod, smile, take notes. At home, I had a different title, wife. We'd been married for 7 years, long enough for routines to replace curiosity, long enough for assumptions to replace questions. My husband, Daniel, often described me as easygoing. He meant it affectionately. He appreciated that I didn't start fights, that I handled logistics, that I remembered birthdays. I adjusted my schedule when his run was long. He liked that I was low drama. I told myself that was maturity. But somewhere along the way, being low drama turned into being low priority. If dinner was late because he stayed out with colleagues, it was normal. If I worked late, it was intense. If I forgot to text back immediately, it was unusual. If he did, it was expected. None of these things was catastrophic. There were no explosive arguments, no broken plates, just patterns. At work, I was the operational backbone. At home, I was the emotional regulator. In both places, I was necessary, but I wasn't centered. There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't come from being ignored. It comes from being useful. When you are useful, people grow comfortable. They stop checking if you're okay because you always are. They stop asking what you need because you rarely request anything. They assume your steadiness is permanent, structural, like a wall that will always hold, and walls don't get thanked. They just get leaned on. I don't say this with bitterness. I wasn't a victim. I participated in this dynamic. I reinforced it. Every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I rearranged my calendar without being asked. Every time I absorbed tension, the room could stay peaceful. I was teaching people how to treat me, and they learned quickly. At work, I became the person who could be trusted with confidential problems, but not necessarily strategic decisions. At home, I became the person who ensured comfort, but not necessarily desire. That's the part no one talks about. Being appreciated is not the same as being valued. Appreciation is gratitude for what you do. Value is recognition of who you are. I was appreciated constantly. I wasn't valued intentionally. And because nothing was dramatically wrong, I told myself everything was fine. Until I started noticing something subtle. When my workday ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt hesitation. When my husband texted, "What's for dinner?" I felt a small tightening in my chest. Not anger, just depletion. And when my manager asked if I could stay an extra hour to help finalize a report, I felt something unexpected. Calm. Predictability. Control. The office felt calmer than my own living room. That sentence scared me the first time it formed fully in my mind. Because it meant something was misaligned not externally, but internally. I wasn't unhappy. I was unacknowledged. And the difference between those two states is quiet. Until it isn't. The first small cut didn't look like a cut at all. It happened on a Tuesday morning during our quarterly operations review. I had spent 3 weeks refining a workflow restructuring plan, mapping inefficiencies, documenting bottlenecks, forecasting cost impact. It wasn't glamorous work. No one applauds a cleaner system, but I knew it mattered. I presented it calmly, slide by slide, clear, concise, no theatrics. When I finished, there was a brief pause. Then my director, Martin, nodded slowly and said, "This is solid groundwork. Jade, we'll have Ethan take it further and build the strategic rollout." Ethan had joined 6 months earlier. Charismatic, confident, loud in a way that reads as leadership in boardrooms. He hadn't contributed to the analysis, but he would take it further. The room shifted subtly. People looked at Ethan. He leaned back in his chair, smiled modestly, and said, "Yeah, I can expand on this and shape it into something executive-facing. As if what I had built wasn't already that. No one meant harm. No one insulted me directly. It was framed as a collaboration, but I felt it, a quiet subtraction. After the meeting, 2 colleagues stopped by my desk. "Great job," one said. "You're so detail-oriented." Detail-oriented, not strategic, not visionary. Detail-oriented. I smiled. "Thanks." That afternoon, I stayed late refining documentation so Ethan would have everything he needed. I told myself it didn't matter who presented it. The company would benefit. The system would improve. I wasn't chasing credit. And that was true. Mostly, but something lodged under my skin. Later that week at home, the echo appeared again. Daniel had invited 2 friends over for dinner. He forgot to tell me until an hour before they arrived. "Hope that's okay," he said casually, loosening his tie. "You're amazing at pulling things together." I rearranged the kitchen, adjusted portions, smiled through the conversation when one of his friends complimented the food. Daniel laughed and said, "Yeah, she's the organized one. I'd be lost without her." Everyone chuckled. It sounded affectionate, but I noticed something missing. He didn't say I was brilliant, or insightful, or ambitious. He described me as infrastructure, reliable, supportive, essential but background. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the apartment was quiet, I sat on the edge of the couch. The television hummed softly. Daniel scrolled on his phone beside me. I replayed the meeting in my mind. The way my work had been repositioned, the way praise was redirected, the way usefulness replaced authorship. And then I thought about dinner. How seamlessly I adjusted. How automatically I absorbed. There was no explosion of anger. No confrontation forming in my throat. Just awareness. It wasn't that people were cruel. It was that they were comfortable. Comfortable assigning me roles I had never explicitly accepted, but had never rejected either. That was the first small cut. Not a wound. Not even a bruise. Just a thin line where something sharp had passed lightly across the surface. And what unsettled me most wasn't what happened. It was how quickly I explained it away. The thing about small cuts is that they rarely arrive alone. They repeat, not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently enough that you begin to adjust your posture around them. After the workflow meeting, Ethan started looping me into follow-up emails, not as a co-lead, but as support. He'd write things like, Jade will handle the documentation and details, which, coincidentally, had been the architecture of the entire strategy. I noticed that when he presented to senior leadership, my name appeared on slide 12 in small font operational analysis, J. Oriana. His name was on slide 1. At first, I rationalized it. He's more extroverted. He's better at executive storytelling. It doesn't matter who speaks, as long as the work gets done. That became my internal script. At home, a similar script was forming. Daniel began assuming I'd manage things before asking, can you book the flights? You're better with logistics. Can you call the landlord? They respond to you. He never said I had to, but he also never offered to. And because I was efficient, because I handled things smoothly, the pattern reinforced itself. One evening, I mentioned that I might apply for a senior operations strategy role in another department. It would involve more visibility, more leadership. Daniel paused mid-scroll. Would that be more stressful, he asked. Probably, I said, but also more impactful. He shrugged slightly. You're already good at what you do. Why complicate it? Why complicate it? The sentence wasn't malicious, but it lingered. At work, I was being streamlined into the background. At home, I was being preserved there. And slowly, without announcing it, I started normalizing it. When Ethan interrupted me mid-sentence in a meeting, I shortened my next point. When my director praised the team's execution, I didn't clarify authorship. When Daniel scheduled a weekend golf trip without checking if I had plans, I rearranged mine. Each adjustment was small, but they accumulated. There's a psychological phenomenon where humans adapt to incremental discomfort so gradually that they stop recognizing it as discomfort at all. That's where I was. I wasn't angry. I wasn't miserable. I was accommodating. One Friday evening, I stayed late again. The office lights dimmed automatically at 7:30 p.m. The cleaning staff moved quietly between desks. My inbox was finally silent. No one needed anything from me in that moment. I leaned back in my chair and realized something unsettling. This was the most relaxed I had felt all week. Not at dinner, not on the couch, not during polite social gatherings, but alone, under fluorescent lights, reviewing systems. The office felt calmer than my own living room. And instead of questioning that immediately, I told myself something convenient. At least here, my effort is measurable. At least here, I know what's expected. At least here, if I do something well, it functions. It doesn't get reinterpreted. It doesn't get softened. It doesn't get absorbed into someone else's identity. I was beginning to understand that what I tolerated repeatedly was becoming the blueprint for how others saw me. Not as someone to overlook, but as someone who would allow being overlooked. That realization didn't make me confrontational. It made me observant. And observation, when sustained long enough, becomes power. But at that stage, I wasn't thinking about power. I was still thinking about peace. And I was still confusing silence with stability. There's a moment when you stop reacting to how people treat you and start recognizing the role they've quietly cast you in. For me, that awareness arrived on an ordinary Thursday. We were in a cross-department meeting, marketing, finance, operations. The conversation had become slightly tense. Deadlines were slipping, budgets were tight, voices weren't raised, but they were sharper than usual. As expected, the discussion eventually turned toward logistics. Jade, can you help us think through this? Someone asked. Of course. I outlined a realistic timeline, identified resource gaps, proposed a compromise that preserved deliverables without inflating costs. The tension eased almost immediately. People nodded. The room softened. Martin smiled. This is why we rely on you. There it was again. Rely. Not lid. Not decide. Rely. In that moment, I saw the role clearly. I wasn't the architect of direction. I was the stabilizer of conflict. The person was brought in after friction, not before it. The reliable one. The emotionally regulated one. The invisible backbone. Later that evening, the parallel appeared at home. Daniel had had a frustrating day. A client deal fell through. He came in restless, irritated in a restrained way. Not angry, just displaced. He spoke for 20 minutes straight about incompetence. market volatility, and bad timing. I listened. I asked thoughtful questions. I reframed his frustration into perspective. By the end of the conversation, he looked lighter. "You always make things clearer," he said. Again, I realized something uncomfortable then. In both environments, I was being used as an emotional shock absorber. At work, I absorbed tension between departments. At home, I absorbed emotional overflow. And because I did it well, the pattern solidified. No one consciously assigned this role to me. I accepted it through consistency. Reliability is rewarded, but it can also become containment. People don't fear losing what feels permanent, and I had positioned myself as permanent. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I stayed up a little longer than usual. I didn't feel angry. I felt categorized. I thought about the strategy role I'd mentioned weeks earlier. No one had followed up. Not my manager. Not my husband. It wasn't hostility. It was an assumption. Assumption that I preferred staying where I was. Assumption that I didn't want disruption. Assumption that I would continue smoothing edges rather than sharpening them. And the most sobering part, I had never contradicted those assumptions. I had been so focused on being dependable that I forgot to signal depth. So I asked myself something quietly. If I disappeared from these roles not physically, but functionally, what would change? Would they notice the absence of comfort, or the absence of me? The difference matters, because one is about service, the other is about presence, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to be appreciated more. I was thinking about how to be positioned differently, not through confrontation, not through demand, but through recalibration. That was the night I stopped asking, "How can I keep this stable?" and started asking, "Why am I the only one stabilizing it?" The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after betrayal. It happened on a Tuesday evening in complete silence. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage beneath our office building. The engine was off, but I hadn't moved. The city above me hummed faintly distant traffic. Elevator doors opening somewhere inside the building. I had just finished finalizing a major implementation document. Ethan had presented the executive summary that afternoon. Leadership approved the initiative. There were congratulatory emails. He was praised for strategic clarity. I was thanked for flawless support. I read both messages twice, and instead of feeling resentment, I felt something colder. Detachment. For the first time, I didn't rush to rationalize it. I didn't tell myself it didn't matter. I didn't immediately open my laptop to refine something else. I just sat there, and I noticed something unsettling. I wasn't tired from overwork. I was tired from misalignment. At home, Daniel had texted earlier running late. "Don't wait up." There was no irritation in me, no disappointment, just a quiet recognition. I realized I was more excited to stay late at work than go home. Not because I loved work more, but because at work, the rules were clear. Effort produced outcomes. Systems responded predictably. At home, emotional labor disappeared into the air. Conversations reset daily without acknowledgement of the pattern. The office felt calmer than my own living room, and that sentence finally stopped feeling like an observation. It felt like a warning. I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, asking myself a question I had avoided for years. What would happen if I stopped overfunctioning? Not quitting, not exploding, just withdrawing the extra, the emotional cushioning, the anticipatory adjustments, the automatic yes. I realized something profound in that stillness. My silence had never actually been peace. It had been maintained. I maintained harmony. I maintained systems. I maintained perception. But I wasn't maintaining myself. And here's what shifted. Instead of asking, "Why don't they see me?" I asked, "Why am I making it so easy not to?" That question changed everything. Because it redirected power. If invisibility is reinforced by predictability, then unpredictability measured and intentional creates recalibration. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Clarity is quieter than anger, but far more decisive. When I finally drove home, I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't craft ultimatums. I made one internal decision. I would stop volunteering stability. If something needed to be discussed, I would discuss it. If something required effort, I would evaluate whether it was mine to give. If someone wanted my reliability, they would have to recognize its value. Not through demands, through absence. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about observing what happened when I stopped preemptively solving problems no one had acknowledged. That night, when Daniel came home past 11, He apologized lightly for the late hour. Normally, I would have said, "It's okay." This time, I said back calmly, "I'd appreciate a little more notice next time." No accusation, no raised voice, just a boundary placed gently on the table. He looked mildly surprised, not defensive, just surprised. And that was when I knew something had truly shifted. Not in him, in me. The difference between passive silence and chosen silence is almost invisible from the outside, but internally, it feels entirely different. Before, my quietness had been automatic, a reflex. I stayed calm because that was who I believed myself to be. I absorbed because it kept everything running smoothly. Now, my silence had intention. I didn't announce the change. I didn't dramatize it. I simply stopped offering more than what was asked. At work, the first test came quickly. Ethan sent an email late Thursday afternoon. "Can you clean up the deck before tomorrow's executive review? Just tighten language and reformat a few slides." Previously, I would have stayed late without hesitation. This time, I responded carefully. "I can review the sections I built. For broader edits, we may need more time." Neutral, professional, clear. There was a pause before his reply. "Got it." The next morning, during the review, 2 slides contained minor formatting inconsistencies. Nothing catastrophic, just noticeable. After the meeting, Martin commented lightly, "We need to polish our materials more thoroughly." He looked at Ethan when he said it. Not me. It was subtle, but it was the first time the assumption of invisible correction had been interrupted. At home, the shift was even quieter. When Daniel mentioned a weekend gathering with friends, I asked, "What time did you plan it for?" He hesitated. "I figured we'd just see." "I'll need specifics," I replied calmly. "I'm planning my weekend too." Planning my weekend too? It was a small sentence, but it repositioned me from accessory to participant. He adjusted, slightly confused, slightly recalibrating. The most interesting part wasn't their reactions. It was my internal experience. I expected guilt. Instead, I felt steadier. There's a common misconception that boundaries create tension. What I began to understand is that unclear boundaries create resentment. Clear ones create adjustment. And adjustment is uncomfortable only for those who benefited from ambiguity. I noticed something else during this period. When I stopped volunteering solutions at work, meetings lasted longer. When I stopped smoothing emotional edges at home, pauses lingered. Silence filled the spaces I used to cushion. No one confronted me directly, but the dynamic shifted. Ethan began preparing more thoroughly. Daniel began asking more questions instead of assuming answers. Not dramatically, not consistently, but noticeably. Here's the psychological nuance I didn't anticipate. When you withdraw from over-functioning, people initially interpret it as temporary. They think you're tired, busy, distracted. They don't immediately assume you've recalibrated your identity. And that grace period, that window before full awareness, creates leverage. I didn't use that leverage to manipulate. I used it to observe. Who steps forward when you step back? Who notices your absence? Who only notices inconvenience? At work, I began documenting my contributions more explicitly, not publicly, privately. At home, I began tracking emotional effort not in a scorekeeping way, but in awareness. Who initiates difficult conversations? Who adjusts schedules? Who anticipates needs? Data clarifies patterns, and patterns reveal truth. For the first time, my silence wasn't protecting harmony. It was a revealing structure. And structure, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. When people underestimate you, they rarely monitor you. That was the first advantage I didn't consciously seek but recognized once it existed. From the outside, nothing dramatic had changed. I still showed up to meetings. I still completed deliverables. I still attended dinners and answered messages. But internally, I had shifted from participant to analyst. At work, I began keeping a private performance log. Not a diary, not emotional commentary, just facts. Project ideation origin point documented. Strategy framework drafted by me. Budget impact modeling completed by me. Presentation delivery assigned elsewhere. No resentment attached, just clarity. I also started studying executive communication patterns. I noticed how Ethan framed ideas less about data, more about positioning, less about precision, more about narrative. So I adjusted not loudly, not competitively. In smaller cross-functional meetings, I began speaking earlier rather than waiting. I summarized outcomes succinctly. I positioned analysis as direction, not support. Instead of saying, Here are the operational details. I began saying, based on this data, I recommend we... Recommendation shifts authority. It was subtle, but language recalibrates hierarchy. Meanwhile, I scheduled one-on-one meetings with senior stakeholders not to complain, not to challenge Ethan, but to align on long-term operational strategy. That phrase alone repositioned me. Long-term, strategy, alignment. I wasn't asking permission to lead. I was demonstrating that I already understood the architecture of leadership. At home, my preparation was quieter. I stopped initiating emotional temperature checks. If Daniel had a difficult day, I listened, but I didn't immediately reframe or solve. I let pauses linger. I observed how long it took for him to ask about my day without prompting. Sometimes it happened quickly. Sometimes it didn't happen at all. Information. I also began revisiting something I had neglected: my own professional development. I enrolled in an advanced leadership certification program online. Evening sessions. Quiet progression. I didn't announce it dramatically. When Daniel asked why I was on my laptop more often, I simply said, I'm expanding my scope. He nodded, mildly surprised, not threatened, just adjusting to a version of me that required explanation. There was another layer no one noticed. I began building external relationships. Former colleagues, industry contacts, recruiters I had politely ignored in the past. Not because I planned to leave immediately, but because optionality is power. The most dangerous position in any system is dependency. I had been indispensable internally, but externally unpositioned. That imbalance was something I quietly corrected. At home, I corrected a similar imbalance. I reopened my personal investment account, something I had paused after marriage because it felt redundant. I reviewed finances independently, not secretly, just attentively. I wasn't preparing to escape. I was preparing to stand alone if necessary. That difference matters. Preparation rooted in fear feels frantic. Preparation rooted in clarity feels calm, and calm is invisible to those who mistake it for compliance. The fascinating psychological shift was this. As I invested more energy into myself, I became less reactive. When Ethan received public praise, I didn't tense. When Daniel forgot a minor detail, I didn't immediately compensate. I was no longer trying to extract validation from spaces that had normalized my background presence. I was building leverage outside their perception, and leverage, when cultivated quietly, changes posture before it changes outcome. No one accused me of withdrawing. No one confronted me about the distance. From their perspective, I was still steady, still reliable, still Jade, but internally, I was no longer stabilizing the system. I was evaluating it. An evaluation always precedes decision. The moment of leverage didn't come from revenge. It came from documentation. 3 months after I began quietly recalibrating, our department prepared for an external audit tied to a major operational overhaul, the same one I had architected from the beginning. Audits are unforgiving. They don't care about charisma. They care about traceability. Every decision had to be justified. Every projection supported. Every structural change is linked to the original data. Guess who had the original data? Not because I was hoarding it, because I had built it. When the auditors began asking detailed process questions, Ethan's responses grew broader, conceptual, vision-oriented. They pressed for documentation, for timestamps, for model versions, for decision rationales, and suddenly, the conversation turned toward me. Jade, can you walk us through the initial modeling framework? One of the auditors asked. I did, calmly, sequentially, without embellishment. I referenced early drafts. I outlined trade-offs. I clarified the reasoning behind specific pivots. I spoke not defensively, but fluently. The room shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. After the session, one of the senior executives pulled me aside. I didn't realize how central you were to this, she said. That sentence landed differently than praise ever had. Not because it validated me, but because it confirmed something structural. The narrative and the architecture had diverged. And in high-stakes moments, architecture wins. That afternoon, Martin asked if I could co-lead the next executive review. Co-lead? It wasn't an apology. It was a recalibration. At home, a parallel realization unfolded more slowly. Daniel had been traveling more frequently for work. One evening, while reviewing shared expenses, I noticed something small but telling. Nearly every discretionary comfort in our life subscriptions, household services, planning logistics had my name attached to initiation. I had built the comfort structure at home the same way I had built operational systems at work. Efficient, invisible, foundational, but when I stopped initiating automatically, certain things stalled. Not catastrophically, just enough to be noticeable. Dinner plans became uncertain. Weekend scheduling became ambiguous. Small emotional disconnects lingered longer. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel looked around the apartment and said lightly, "Things feel different lately." "They are," I replied. I didn't list grievances. I simply let the statement sit, because here was the private reveal. I wasn't the background support in either system. I was the stabilizing core. And when the stabilizing core withdraws excess effort, instability surfaces not because of sabotage, but because of exposure. The leverage wasn't explosive. It was structural. At work, executives now saw my authorship. At home, Daniel began sensing the absence of invisible labor. But here's the important part. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Clarity strips drama from power. The most interesting psychological observation during this period was this. People often misattribute stability to themselves when someone else is quietly maintaining it. When that maintenance becomes visible through absence, they reassess. Not emotionally at first. Practically, who handles this? Who decides that? Who initiates this conversation? And when the answer is consistently you, perception shifts. The private reveal wasn't a confrontation. It was recognition. Not from them entirely, but from me. I understood, finally, that my invisibility had never been due to insignificance. It had been due to overfunctioning without authorship. Once authorship was documented factually, calmly, there was no need for emotional argument. Evidence speaks differently from frustration, and evidence had begun speaking. That's when I reached the most important question yet. Now that I know my leverage, what will I do with it? Because power discovered requires direction, and direction, once chosen, becomes irreversible. Leverage is neutral. It doesn't tell you what to do. It simply expands your options. And options are dangerous when you've spent years convincing yourself you didn't need any. After the audit recalibration at work and the subtle shift at home, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. No crisis, no scandal, no dramatic ultimatum. Just clarity. At work, I had 3 choices. I could continue as before, accept the new visibility, allow co-lead to gradually become real leadership, and remain inside the same structure that had underestimated me. I could confront the past, directly ask why my authorship had been minimized, demand formal recognition, and renegotiate positioning explicitly. Or I could leverage my documented impact and external relationships to reposition myself entirely, not out of anger, but out of alignment. At home, the options mirrored that same triad. I could resume overfunctioning now that Daniel was beginning to notice the shift return to equilibrium. Preserve comfort. I could initiate a deep confrontation about emotional imbalance list patterns, unpack years of quiet accommodation, or I could observe whether adjustment would happen organically once I stopped stabilizing everything. The irreversible choice wasn't loud. It was strategic. I chose alignment. At work, instead of pressing for retroactive credit, I accepted the executive's invitation to present independently at the next cross-functional summit, and simultaneously, I scheduled exploratory interviews with 2 external firms, not because I hated my company, but because I no longer wanted my growth to depend on someone else's recalibration speed. Optionality isn't betrayal. It's autonomy. At home, instead of initiating the big talk, I made a different move. I stopped filling the silence. When Daniel sensed distance and asked, "Is everything okay?" I didn't rush to reassure. I answered honestly, but minimally. "I'm thinking about what I want long-term." He blinked, slightly unsettled. "Like, career." "Yes," I said. And then I added, "Gently, in life." That was the irreversible moment. Not because I threatened to leave, but because I signaled that my horizon extended beyond maintenance. Once someone realizes you are evaluating the system, not surviving inside it, the dynamic shifts permanently. The fascinating part of this phase was emotional neutrality. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt decisive. And decisiveness, when calm, unsettles people more than anger ever could. Anger invites counterattack. Calm evaluation invites uncertainty. At work, Ethan began asking more explicitly for my input before presentations. At home, Daniel began initiating conversations he had previously deferred. Neither reaction was dramatic. Both were reactive. But I wasn't making decisions based on their reaction speed. I was making decisions based on internal alignment. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking, how do I keep this stable? I was asking, does this structure match my capacity? And if it doesn't, am I willing to outgrow it? The decision wasn't about destruction. It was about direction. And once direction is chosen internally, the external consequences simply unfold. Once the decision was made internally, everything that followed looked ordinary. That's the nature of strategic movement. It rarely announces itself. At work, I didn't resign. I didn't confront. I didn't make grand declarations about being overlooked. I began consolidating authorship. Every proposal I drafted now carried my name clearly in the executive summary. Not aggressively, just accurately. Instead of sending complete frameworks for others to shape, I presented polished, executive-ready versions directly to stakeholders when appropriate. If Ethan wanted to collaborate, he did so alongside me, not ahead of me. When the cross-functional summit arrived, I stood on stage alone. Not as co-lead, as the lead presenter. I didn't embellish. I didn't reference past dynamics. I simply walked through strategic architecture with clarity and precision. The response wasn't applause heavy, it was attentive. Afterward, 2 department heads approached me independently about future initiatives. Visibility had shifted not because I demanded it, but because I occupied it. At the same time, my external conversations progressed quietly. One firm offered a lateral move with higher visibility. Another offered a direct strategy role reporting to the COO. I didn't rush. I reviewed compensation structures, growth trajectories, cultural indicators. I negotiated calmly. No desperation, no emotional undertone. Optionality creates steadiness. At home, my movement was even subtler. I adjusted my schedule to include leadership coursework twice a week, in-person networking events once a month, and independent financial planning sessions. I didn't hide these, but I also didn't seek permission. When Daniel asked, "Do you have something tonight?" I would answer, "Yes." No explanation beyond what was necessary. He began checking the shared calendar more frequently. Small sign. When household logistics stalled because I hadn't preemptively handled them, I didn't step in immediately. If he forgot to confirm dinner reservations, we ordered something simple instead. No resentment, just consequence. The interesting psychological shift during this phase was this. People sense movement before they understand it. Daniel became more attentive, not dramatically romantic. Not suddenly transformed, but observant. He asked more about my projects. He listened more closely when I spoke. At work, Ethan became more collaborative, less assumptive. Neither reaction was born from confrontation. It was born from repositioning. The key distinction is important. Confrontation demands recognition. Repositioning makes recognition inevitable, and I was no longer trying to correct the past. I was shaping the future. The most irreversible action happened on a quiet Wednesday morning. I accepted the external offer, not because I was desperate to leave, but because the new structure matched the scale of my capability without requiring constant recalibration. I gave formal notice 2 weeks later. Martin looked genuinely surprised. "We were preparing to expand your scope," he said. I nodded. I appreciate that. No accusation, no lecture, just acknowledgement. The decision wasn't emotional. It was aligned. At home, I didn't present the new role as a crisis. I presented it as a progression. Daniel sat very still while I explained. "You didn't mention you were looking seriously," he said. "I was evaluating," I replied. Evaluation. The word hung between us. And for the first time, I could see him understanding something fundamental. I wasn't fixed in place. I had simply chosen to stay until I chose otherwise. Consequences rarely announce themselves with noise. They unfold in small disruptions. My final 2 weeks at the company were polite, professional, almost too smooth. Ethan tried to position my departure as a natural progression, Jade's moving into an exciting new chapter. Martin scheduled transition meetings to redistribute responsibilities. But something subtle began surfacing almost immediately. During handover sessions, I outlined system dependencies, process interlocks that had never been formally documented because I had simply managed them intuitively. As I explained the layers, I saw something shift in their expressions. "Oh," Ethan said at one point, scanning a flowchart. "I didn't realize this connected to 3 separate reporting pipelines." "It does," I replied calmly. No emphasis, no satisfaction. Just a fact. By the second week, emails began arriving with increasing frequency. Quick clarification on the vendor escalation protocol. Where do we track revision history for cross-team approvals? Can you resend the original cost variance model? I answered professionally, but I didn't overextend. I provided documentation, not ongoing support. The difference was important. At home, consequences unfolded more quietly. With my new role starting soon, my schedule shifted, early strategy sessions, occasional travel, evening industry events. The domestic rhythm adjusted accordingly. Daniel began handling more logistics, not because I asked, but because necessity required it. The first time he forgot to confirm a maintenance appointment and had to reschedule around his own work call, I didn't rescue the situation. I simply asked, "What time will they come tomorrow?" He paused, recalibrating. There's something destabilizing about realizing the person who kept things seamless is no longer buffering every misalignment, not because they withdrew affection, but because they withdrew the excess. The emotional consequence wasn't anger, it was awareness. One evening, about a week before I started my new job, Daniel said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you were managing." I looked at him steadily. I wasn't trying to hide it. That sentence wasn't an accusation. It was reality. At work, my last day arrived with a polite farewell gathering. There were kind words, a card, generic well wishes. But after the formalities, one senior executive pulled me aside. "If you ever consider returning," she said, "we'd structure things differently from the start." Different from the start. That's the quiet power of leaving strategically, not storming out, not burning bridges, just exiting in alignment. Absence reveals architecture. When I walked out of that building for the last time, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt lighter, not because they suffered, but because I no longer needed them to recognize what I already understood. At home, the emotional landscape shifted more slowly. Daniel became more attentive, not performatively, not dramatically, but intentionally. He asked more questions about my ambitions. He began initiating weekend plans collaboratively, rather than assuming availability. Not because I demanded it, but because stability had proven conditional, and conditional stability demands respect. Consequences had begun. Not explosive, not destructive, just recalibrating. And recalibration, once initiated, never fully reverses. There's a subtle but irreversible moment in every dynamic shift, the point where recalibration turns into realization. At my former company, that moment arrived about 6 weeks after I left. A former colleague called me one evening. "Do you have 5 minutes?" she asked carefully. I stepped onto my balcony, city lights flickering below. "They're struggling," she said. "Not catastrophically, but the systems keep overlapping in ways no one anticipated. Ethan's overwhelmed. Leadership keeps asking for structural clarity." I listened. Not smug, not surprised. Just unsurprised. "They're trying to rebuild documentation from memory," she added quietly. "Memory is fragile. Architecture isn't." After we hung up, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Finality. It was too late to retroactively structure what had been built through intuition and silent authorship. Because structure requires proximity, and I was no longer proximate. At home, a similar realization unfolded more intimately. One Saturday morning, Daniel and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No tension, no raised voices, just stillness. "I think I got comfortable," he said finally, with what I asked gently. "With you always handling things? Emotionally, logistically?" I didn't see it because it felt normal. Normal. That word again. He looked genuinely unsettled, not panicked, not desperate, but aware. "I don't want you to feel like background support," he said. I studied him carefully. "I don't feel like background support anymore," I replied. That was the difference. His realization had come after my shift, not before, and timing matters. Because once someone repositions themselves internally, external apologies don't restore the original structure. They simply acknowledge it. "I don't want to lose what we have," he continued. The sentence hung in the air. I didn't respond immediately, not to create tension, but because I was measuring alignment. "Then we both need to build it differently," I said calmly. No accusations about the past, no detailed autopsy of years of imbalance, just a forward-facing condition. Here's what's psychologically significant about this phase. When someone realizes they underestimated you, their instinct is often to compensate quickly, to fix, to reassure, but repair without structural change is just temporary behavior modification. And I wasn't interested in temporary reassurance. I was interested in sustainable balance. At work, leadership eventually hired a consultant to streamline operations, essentially reconstructing what had existed organically under my oversight. Consultants are expensive. Absence is costly. At home, Daniel began initiating weekly planning conversations, something I used to carry alone. He began asking direct questions about my long-term goals. He began, slowly, participating in emotional regulation instead of outsourcing it. But here's the honest truth. Even as adjustments happened, something fundamental had shifted in me. I no longer feared instability. I no longer clung to maintenance as identity. That internal independence cannot be reversed by apology. It doesn't make you colder. It makes you anchored. And once anchored in yourself, no one can quietly reposition you without consent again. Too late to fix the past, but not too late to build differently if both people are willing. The difference now was this. I wasn't hoping. I was evaluating. The word confrontation usually implies volume, raised voices, sharp edges, emotional overflow. But the most transformative confrontation of my life happened in complete calm. It was a Tuesday evening. No special occasion. No argument preceding it. Daniel and I were sitting across from each other after dinner. The apartment was quiet in that ordinary way it had been for years. "I want to understand something," he said carefully. I nodded. "When did you start pulling back?" There was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity layered with regret. I didn't rush to soften the truth. I didn't pull back. I said, I stopped overextending. He absorbed that. Silence followed, not heavy, just reflective. For a long time, I continued. I was stabilizing things before they needed to be stabilized. I handled tension before it surfaced. I managed logistics before they became problems. And I did it so consistently that it felt invisible. He looked down at his hands. "I thought that was just how you were," he admitted. "It is how I am," I replied gently. "But it's not all I am." That distinction mattered. I wasn't accusing him of exploitation. I was naming a dynamic. "I didn't realize you felt unseen," he said. "I didn't either," I answered honestly. "Not at first." That was the truth. There had been no dramatic wake-up call. Just accumulation. "I don't want to compete with your career," he said after a moment. "Or your independence. I just didn't expect it to change this quickly." "It didn't change quickly," I said calmly. "It changed quietly." That sentence settled between us. Quiet change unsettles people because it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't give warnings in dramatic form. It simply recalibrates. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The old version of me would have listed specifics immediately. Actionable items, clear directives. But this wasn't a performance review. "I need partnership," I said. "No appreciation for holding things together. Participation in holding them." He nodded slowly. "And if I fail sometimes, you will," I said gently. "So will I." No threats. No ultimatums. Just reality. The confrontation didn't end with tears or declarations. It ended with something more sustainable. Clarity. At work, I experienced a parallel moment during a follow-up call with my former executive. "We underestimated the structural load you were carrying," she admitted. "I don't think it was intentional," I replied. "It wasn't," she said, "but it was systemic." "Exactly. Not villainy. Structure. And structure changes only when exposed." That night at home, Daniel reached across the table and said something simple. "I see you differently now." I held his gaze. "Good," I said, not because I needed validation, but because being seen accurately, fully, is the foundation of real partnership. There was no heat, no explosion, just recalibration spoken aloud. And sometimes, that's the most powerful confrontation of all. If you met me now, you might not notice anything dramatic. I still speak calmly. I still think before I respond. I still value stability. But the foundation underneath those traits is different. I no longer equate usefulness with worth. That was the quiet trap I had lived inside for years, the belief that being needed was the same as being valued. It isn't. Need can be transactional. Value is intentional. In my new role, I operate differently from the beginning. I enter meetings as an architect, not a stabilizer. When I speak, I position recommendations, not support. When credit is distributed, I don't deflect it automatically. I acknowledge collaboration without erasing authorship. It doesn't make me louder. It makes me anchored. And anchoring changes posture in ways that people feel immediately. At home, the dynamic is evolving not perfectly, not magically, but consciously. Daniel and I plan together now. He carries weight not as a favor to me, but as a responsibility to us. There are still moments when old patterns try to resurface, when it would be easier for me to absorb tension quickly and move on, but I don't. Not out of stubbornness, out of alignment. I've learned something fundamental about quiet dominance. It isn't about overpowering others. It's about refusing to abandon yourself for comfort. For years, I thought peace meant smoothing every edge. Now I understand that real peace requires shared accountability. I don't romanticize independence as isolation. I don't treat a partnership as dependence. I stand alone well enough that standing together becomes a choice, not a necessity. That distinction changed everything. There's another shift I've noticed internally. I don't over-explain myself anymore. When I accept an opportunity, I say yes. When I decline, I say no. Without cushioning language to make it more palatable. Not because I've become cold, but because I trust that clarity is kinder than ambiguity. The office no longer feels like a refuge from home. Home no longer feels like a space I must maintain alone. Both environments feel collaborative, not because others transformed overnight, but because I stopped performing the role of invisible stabilizer. Who I am now isn't louder. She's clearer. She understands that silence can be strategic, but only when chosen. She understands that absence reveals structure. She understands that power doesn't require spectacle. And most importantly, she understands that being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it. Not anymore. If you've listened this far, you might have expected a sharper ending. A dramatic resignation, a marriage ultimatum, a moment where someone falls apart under the weight of realizing they were wrong. But that's not how quiet dominance works. It doesn't explode. It recalibrates. No one in my life became a villain. No one set out to diminish me. They simply adapted to the version of me that required the least adjustment from them. And for a long time, that version of me was easy to lean on. The moral of this story isn't leave immediately. It isn't confront aggressively. And it isn't prove them wrong. It's this: if you constantly stabilize everything around you, people will assume stability is effortless for you. Not because they are cruel, but because humans normalize what feels consistent. When I realized I was more excited to stay late at work than go home, it wasn't a sign that I loved work more. It was a sign that one environment had a clear structure and the other relied too heavily on my invisible labor. The office felt calmer than my own living room, and instead of resenting that truth, I examined it. Silence became a tool instead of a shield. Absence became information instead of punishment. Alignment became more important than approval. You don't need to shout to be powerful. You don't need to humiliate anyone to shift a dynamic. Sometimes, the most irreversible move is simply this: stop over-functioning. Let the structure reveal itself, and decide calmly whether it still matches who you are becoming. So now I want to ask you something. Have you ever mistaken being needed for being valued? And if you stopped stabilizing everything today, what would change? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.